Hello survivors and welcome to a special First Aid Spray endorsed video for the Horror Game Awards, as I, KDB, am joined by Steve from First Aid Spray, and we are here... Hello Steve, sorry I cut you off there because I'm excited. We're here once again for the second year in a row to give the official First Aid Spray nomination for Horror Video Game of the Year for the Horror Game Awards. Now, Steve, before we reveal our nomination... what does horror gaming mean to you? Take it away.
Okay, that's a big one. For me, it's horror as a genre is always a way to push the envelope. You know, not necessarily to be super scary, but can be a lot more avant-garde and a lot more risky, and allows fiction to stretch a few more boundaries. You know, it's that like the cooler cousin of science fiction sometimes, or fantasy. And for me. Yeah, I see it as a way of pushing the envelope, and sometimes the industry uses it to push genre, like definition of what can and can't be an action game, an adventure game, a point-and-click game, a little bit of risk, a little bit of violence, a little bit of horror, or just an excuse for some genuinely fun, interesting storytelling.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think I've said many times how much I love horror movies and how they were always a big part of my life growing up. Like, horror movies were deeply embedded with me before horror video games really were, so when... I think horror games, and particularly the original Resident Evil, became this very similar to a horror movie experience, but more immersive. That's when they struck a nerve with me, or struck a chord with me, I should say, and then have done forever. And like some of my favourite games of all time are horror games. It's just something that I think continues to, like you say, what was you saying? Push the genre and advance things. It really, really does. And this year, 2023, as we know, it's been a crazy year for video games and bangers of releases. Once again, horror games continue to be a big part of the gaming industry. They're very popular with streamers and all this kind of stuff. We're not here to dissect horror games in general today, because we're going to talk about one in particular. But I just thought it was important to just kind of recognise how crazy it is out there for horror games and how we've had a bit of resurgence over the past few years. We just recently did a 5 years of First Aid Spray where we talked about just Resident Evil alone and how that's kind of like in a silver age. But in that, we touched on the various horror games that have released over the past few years. And I'd say that it feels horror games are bigger than ever, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. I feel like we're in not just the AAA space, the indie space as well is having a massive boom. You know, obviously there'll be some stuff of middling quality, there always is, but you know, the banger to clanger ratio, that's a technical term, is like vast. There is some peak quality, high, I don't know what the right word would be, just using the word quality over and over again as an adjective is kind of rubbish, but it's really good. It's very polished, it's very tidy, Kells.
Yeah, it's kind of unreal, like how many good horror games, and particularly you mentioning the indie side. Like, I played more indie horror games in the last like 2 years than I have in my entire life combined, and I think, you know, that says something a lot about the state that horror games are in, which is a very good state. And so, yeah, speaking of good horror games, as we've mentioned, that's why we're here today, to give our nomination for Horror Game of the Year for the Horror Game Awards. Now, before we reveal it, and I'll let you do the honours, we've been back and forth on this, and because this has been, as I said, a crazy time, and very particularly recently, it's been something that we've been back and forth on, because there's been a couple of big releases in particular this year, but then there was one earlier at the start of the year, and so we've been back and forth. And I don't know, I've been on a journey in just the past couple of weeks about what I thought would be a good nomination, and we've been DMing and messaging and talking about it, and we've kind of landed at a point where part of me thinks, okay, are we just nominating this game to give it some recognition that we think it deserves? But then the more I think about it, the more I'm like, it's very, very hard to criticize the game that we're going to nominate today, despite the enjoyment that I've had with some other games, which we're going to touch on. So, yes.
Are we nominating it for the sake of nominating it? I don't think so. I think it's got its own merits, as we'll get to.
Yeah. So yeah, rather than me sort of keep people in suspense, why don't you take it away, Steve? What is the first aid spray endorsed, and this is mainly me and you, horror game of the year? What's our nomination for horror game of the year?
It's Signalis again for the Nintendo Switch. I'm kidding. Obviously, it'd be nice to nominate it again. No, our nomination for the Horror Game Awards this year is Dead Space.
It is Dead Space, and I almost, like I say, almost can't believe we're saying that, because we'll get to Dead Space. I've just come off the back of 3 solid weeks of being immersed in the Alan Wake verse. We've come off the back of the video game awards, the big awards show, which Alan Wake has got lots of nominations for. And we've seen lots of flowers given to Alan Wake over the past couple of weeks. And no flowers given to Dead Space, which is why I say I was thinking, are we nominating this just for recognition? But I'm going to talk about my experience with Dead Space. But before we get to that, do you want to give some honorary words to Alan Wake? And because it was between those two that we were kind of back and forth
I would say so. Yeah. Despite us being a Resident Evil themed podcast, the contenders that really were in our mind were Alan Wake 2 and Dead Space.
Yeah.
But there's something about, and I'm probably going to be contrary to a lot of the other panelists and the other judges, right? There are a lot of bugs with Alan Wake 2. There are a lot of serious issues with how it performs on the next gen machines, PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series. But moreover than that, the story is fantastic, right? The gameplay part of the game is kind of rough. Like, it's Resident Evil 2 light, but the enemies are a little bit on the dull side, excluding one that probably will be talked about where it's half submerged and stuff. The atmosphere, that musical segment, will live with me for the rest of my life, right? But the gameplay itself of Alan Wake 2 is, honestly, I think it's inferior to its first iteration or even Control. It trying to be survival horror works some of the time, but not all the time in that game.
I think the story is, and the narrative and the writing, and like you say, the sort of the iconic use of the music, the performances, it's so unbelievably incredible in Alan Wake that it absolutely does favours to the game, which kind of, I guess, hide its shortcomings. Now,
yes.
Just from a personal experience, as you know, and as a few people know, when I fired up Alan Wake 2, I was very frustrated because of the bugs that you mentioned, in particular some audio bugs. And I gave Remedy a week to patch the game to fix those bugs. And it didn't arrive. That patch did not arrive. There were still bugs. It arrived a little bit later than that, but initially I gave them a week. So I brute forced it, and I played my way through Alan Wake 2. And we're not here to review that game. Yeah, it's an incredible game in lots of ways, but my playthrough was absolutely plagued with bugs, and I have to be honest about that. And the more I think about it in retrospect, the more I cannot fault the story side, really, and the universe and the world building and all this stuff, and it does some things that you just don't see in other video games. But when we're looking at the experience as a whole, there are some holes in it. And then...
And I say, it's the HGAs, right? I'm assuming that's what they want to be called, the THGAs. Like, if they had multiple Jura brackets, right, no question would be nominating Alan Wake 2 for other things.
Yeah.
Like...
Yeah. And what's funny is, so my frustrations with that game with the bugs, what happened, Steve? Something funny happened is a game came along to rescue me in that week that I was waiting for the patch. And that game was indeed Dead Space 2003, I should say. It came to Game Pass, and I thought, right, finally, I'm going to play this. And I'd kind of had every intention to buy it when it had gone on sale and something like that, because I wanted to get around to it. But it dropped to Game Pass, so I had no excuse. It arrived, I think, a few days before Alan Wake released. So I was hungry for that horror, survival horror experience, whatever. I was in that mood. Dead Space came along and it rescued me. And I messaged you pretty soon after starting playing it, like, just saying how, like, it has rescued me. Yeah, it's just, this is game of the year, like, and I know you were playing Alan Wake 2, and he's like, I need to finish it, and then we'll make a call. But Yeah, I'm going to talk about what I think about Dead Space. It came for me right place, right time when Alan Wake couldn't deliver something that I wanted. What was your experience like with it? I mean, if you want to talk about the original, go ahead. But as far as this remake goes, what do you think about it? Why are you nominating it here today, Steve?
Sheer quality and consistency of story, action, and being honestly out of the litany, the absolute cascade of remade games, this might be one of the best ones we've had in at least half a decade, and that's no shyness. I love RE2R, RE3R, 4R. But respect to the source material, but also bolting in new stuff where it's appropriate. They've tweaked issues with the original version of Dead Space and made it that much more of a... I don't want to say it's the definitive experience, because I still have a giant place in my heart for the original Dead Space. But if you have to possibly play a survival horror game with a on-point atmosphere that captures the spirit of the original while doing a little bit of its own thing, you can't really go wrong. The franchise itself holds a very dear part for me. When Resident Evil was, shall we say, straying from its path into extreme action, yes, with the 5 in your 6, Dead Space was kind of like that middle ground. Even though it was still very action orientated, it managed to keep that horror, that scare, and that suspense, and they've still managed to capture that. And bringing that kind of 2008 action horror vibe to the current year, it brings a euphoria to me. Maybe it's just the fact that I like snapping necromorphs in half with a line cutter, or the fact that Gunnar Wright gets to reprise the character that he pretty much has made his own. He was Isaac in Dead Space 2, he was Isaac in Dead Space 3, but in the original, he was a mute. He didn't say a word. He just let's just grunt noises. Now he brings a hell of a lot of character to the role to be a pretty solid performance, it has to be said.
Yeah. So when it comes to the original Dead Space, I have started that game maybe 3 times since launch, and and that's not because I wasn't enjoying it. It's one of those things. This happens with games sometimes where other stuff just comes along, or something distracts you, and then you put it down and you never get back to it. And so I had tried multiple times to get through it, and I think the furthest I'd got was a couple of hours maybe. And
yeah,
I loved what I played, but it's just one of those games that always got away from me. And then earlier this year, when this remake was announced, I thought, finally, this is going to be the time I'm going to play it. And then the year got away from me, and it's still... Because what we should say is this came out in January, and often in award season, the games that come out early in the year, they're in danger of getting forgotten. But it's obviously left its mark on you, and despite me being late to the party for Dead Space, And another thing, what's funny is it came out at the same time as Callisto Protocol, which a lot of people made comparisons to. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that and what that may have done to the people that might have even played this game this year or not played it.
It's a strange and bitter situation, because obviously the cancellation of Dead Space, much as I've said, upset me, and might be why I like it so much now. Callisto Protocol was made by some of the original dev team of the original Dead Space, and as time has kind of proven, it has been a bit of a hollow experience, a bit of fancy graphics, tedious game, tedious story, not a lot other than presentation. Whereas Dead Space didn't really kind of have that aplomb. You've got to choose 2 big games of the year. Do you go one by the original devs, or do you go by a remake done by fans of the original? Sure, but not necessarily the original team. It's ironic that the second one is the better product. I think hopefully there has been enough positive kickback towards Dead Space that we'll actually see the series carry on reviving. The whole point of the necromorphs is that they're dead tissue that reanimates. Hopefully the same says for the franchise. But I don't know, there's something that says that the fact that Callisto Protocol sold more despite being a much direr experience leaves me a little bit downward looking, but sad objectives. Bad nouns.
So it definitely got drowned out a little bit by Callisto Protocol, and as I say, and then
Resident Evil 4 comes out not long after,
exactly,
which we all like. You like RE4R more than the original Resident Evil 4, for example. But there was a lot of divisive content in that game. I'm not even going to go into the stuff regarding Lily Gao. I thought she was fine as Ada. but there are other characters that get rewritten as well, and that upset people. But the gameplay's pretty good in that.
Yeah, do go and listen to our... It's probably nearly 4 hours, the Resident Evil 2 remake review, isn't it, for First Data Spray?
Yeah.
So do and go check that out. But yes, when it comes to Dead Space, so yeah, it passed me by this year, and so I was late to the party, but it's so weird to describe it in this way, and I don't know if I described it this way to you or some other friends, but I just had so much fun playing Dead Space Remake, because this is what happens when a game runs well, looks beautiful, and does what it's set out to do. You know, it's not painful to play, and it's not tedious. A horror experience can be so much fun. And you mentioned using the cutter to cut off limbs. I mean, it's just it does not take long to dump you into the action. It throws these creatures at you really early in the game. The concept is there. Cut off their limbs. It's in blood on the wall. You know, the instruction is there for you. So as long as you're not too squeamish, you're going to have a load of fun. And I was very down on not being able to play Alan Wake 2. This game just brought me right back up to Cloud 9 and had so much fun. And it was I love to do this with horror games. It's late in the evening. I could turn the lights off, put my headphones on, and I'm there. And we can talk about presentation all day. It looks stunning on the consoles. It sounds stunning. The music, the sound effects, everything about it it threw me onto that ship and it threw me into the world. And I was having an absolute blast and couldn't wait. I have to go to bed, couldn't wait the next day to jump right back in and get through. And I have a bad habit of not finishing games because I like playing so much stuff and time is limited and I jump around. So, I've got like 4 half-finished games in rotation at the moment. But Dead Space, no, I was playing nothing else. I wanted to see this through. So, and you can feel that classic type of game. It shines through in the remake, but it looks like a modern game and it feels like a modern game. So, yeah, that was my biggest takeaway. It was definitely a horror experience because I, quote unquote, myself multiple times, and because it's very good at doing that. It has a habit of throwing stuff creeping up behind you as well. The atmosphere is fantastic, but it has a level of action which I think keeps it doesn't go so crazy with the action that you do end up maybe in a place like RE4, which I think is far more action than Dead Space, which still feels slightly more contained with the combat and the things like that. So for me, it always felt like a horror experience. I did play it. Did I play it on? I think I might have played it on easy, but because I wanted to get through it quickly.
Okay, that's fair.
But there were still times I struggled, and I thought, and I was imagining myself like, well, I'm kind of happy that I'm not playing this on normal or hard right now because this is going to be a real challenge to get through with the different creatures and all that kind of stuff. But the whole time playing Dead Space Remake, as I say, definitely on the edge of my seat, definitely scared, but just blown away with the presentation and having so much fun. I'm using that F word, fun. And sometimes that can do a lot for a horror game because I think of something like Alien Isolation, which I love. There's times where I'm not having a good time playing that game. And I love it. But at
pushing
no point...
out some kind of diamond out of the rear end.
At no point was I not having a good time playing Dead Space Remake. And, it's definitely one of the most well-rounded, complete packages and experiences I've played this year. And it was easily digestible as well, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Now, I know you're not as au fait, as familiar with the original, but I just want to shout out some of the cool little things that this one does that the original didn't. In the original, every chapter was literally one set chapter. You would occasionally revisit parts of the ship, right? But that was it. Now it's a interconnected Spencer Mansion of a spaceship. That level of interconnectivity allows for a lot more routes, a lot more randomized scares. It's now got an AI director to dictate these sequences. It's amazing how much more alive a ship feels when you can go through a corridor you think you've gone through 3 or 4 times and it's been fine, and all of a sudden the lights go out. And then a necromorph bursts through the ceiling. And then sometimes it's totally fine. That level of thing adds to the immersion factor for it, I feel. What else? Oh yeah, there's the whole peeling thing, I suppose. If you're really into the grim violence of the future, you can now obliterate the entire flesh off of a thing and it still comes at you screaming somehow without lungs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did look it. I think if I had a criticism, it would be the story is fine, but I mean, I don't think it. You know, we're talking about Alan Wake and the story that did. I mean, Dead Space is not trying to do anything like that. There's lots of fantastic lore in the files that you can read, and that's another thing that I was doing. You know, which kind of that speaks to your engagement with the thing you're playing. I think if you're not that engaged, you may skip over a bunch of files, but with Dead Space, no, I was reading everything, and it's sort of the way it slowly unravels and then just kind of dumps a lot on you at the end, I thought was really good. If I had a criticism, it was just like, yeah, the story was kind of fine, but it felt like it was serviceable to the entire experience, which was a horror action experience, which looked beautiful and played beautiful. And and what's weird is, I think everyone I know that has played this game says how incredible it is. And I'm glad that we're nominating it today, because there's still time for it to get recognition. And I don't want to, you know, EA, them doing something like this and making this happen. Like, we want to, let's give them their credit where it's due. You know, sometimes through gritted teeth, we want to say EA are doing something brilliant, but and making this happen. But I really hope this is not the end of this Dead Space revival, which you've kind of touched on, because hopefully word gets out there, and through things like this and us singing its praises, more people will play it. And the fact it came to Game Pass, I mean, let's be honest, it should get a few more people playing as well. It got me playing it, so yeah. Do you want to see more of this kind of thing?
Oh, 100% yes. Like, the level of detail of this is almost like obnoxious in a way. Like, you can go out into zero-G environments in this game, be in space, be frozen. The second you go inside, it melts off, and your suit's got like a blood-stained or panned mirror sheen. The sounds change depending on what room you're in, be it like, you know, a high-pressure room, zero-gravity room, all sorts of other random stuff. It's the audio detail in particular gets, you'd be benefit playing this one with headphones, is all I'm saying.
Definitely.
The weakness, really, that we touched on about the story being essentially the first Dead Space's story. Yes, okay, but they've now added side missions and content to like flesh out and tie it more into the mythology it's built around itself. A solid piece of how to do a remake. I know they basically took notes from Capcom, not unlike other people who have been doing other things recently, but they did enough of their own thing that I would like to see, you know, more of this sort of thing. Take the original and expand it rather than reduce it or chop and change it a little too hard.
Yeah, I agree. I'd love to see more. And I'm going to put you on the spot now before we wrap up, because there's been a contentious hot topic that's been going around since the Game Awards announced their own Game of the Year nominations. And that's a few people took issue with the fact that Resident Evil 4 Remake was nominated because it is a remake. Now, we're sat here today nominating a remake for Horror Game of the Year for the Horror Game Awards. What's your opinion on a remake being nominated over, say, a new IP or a new? I'm not saying a new IP, but a new game in a series? It's not Dead Space 4 or whatever. But yeah, I don't know if you've seen much of that chatter out there. But I've got some thoughts.
Unfortunately, I have.
Yeah, but how do you feel about
generally
that?
Speaking, I feel like if a game excels, it shouldn't matter whether it's a remake, a remaster, or whatever. You know, if someone has took the time to actually elevate a product to the point where people are going, "Oh wow, that is like a banger for this year," great. This is also a game that came out in 2008, like being redone in 2023. That's a significant amount of time. That's almost double the amount of time between the original Resident Evil and its remake. It's not just a one-to-one port. Like, this isn't just we've gone from 1080p to 4K textures re-rendering. It's an actual rebuild.
Yeah.
This took effort. The redirected cutscenes, reworked narrative to fit a previously mute character into actually being a character. You know? Not to mention all the gunplay tweaks, the revised bosses, the whole, like, you know, asteroid gun turret sections have been removed and replaced with an actually enjoyable zero-G calibration thing. Yeah, no. If a game's a remake or not doesn't disbar it. Do I think more new IP should get celebrated? Of course. Like, you know, are we doing honorable mentions today? I believe we've
got a few.
Yeah, there are plenty of new IPs that need shouting out, of course. But that doesn't mean that just because something's been rebuilt that it's not allowed to be celebrated as well.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. Like, this is not us nominating the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection for Game of the Year because of, oh yes, those original games are incredible and, you know, they still excel now, but, you know, we're not going to open that can of worms with the state of that collection. But I think you mentioned the word effort, like the monumental amount of work that has gone into this Dead Space remake and the Resident Evil 4 remake more than qualify it being in the conversation for Game of the Year. And if you're playing that game, whether it's a remake or not, if it's delivering that experience that engages you and grabs you more than other games did, it needs its recognition. And that's why I think we're talking about it here today. So yes, it is our official nomination. It's the Dead Space remake. We love it. We think it's fantastic. It came and rescued me from the bugs of Alan Wake. And Steve is obviously a lifelong die-hard fan, and it's given him everything he wanted and more. But as you mentioned, there were lots of other horror games, and we wanted to give a couple of shout-outs and recommendations. And I don't know if I think you might have some, but I know there was a couple I played. There was one specifically that I played this year, which was Ad Infinitum, which was a game that I think it's come out around the same time as Amnesia: The Bunker, which so they're two World War I games. They're sharing very similar DNA. Ad Infinitum, I'm not here going to review the whole thing, but I'll just say that, you know, this was the type of thing where you want these big AAA horrors to deliver that, lean into that horror and deliver that unique experience. And that was one of the games that did that for me. And if Dead Space and Alan Wake hadn't come out this year, it would have been my horror game of the year easily. But yes, were there any other games that you played this year you thought deserved a shout out?
Oh, 100% yes. Like I'm gonna do this because James isn't here because you know he's not part of the Horror Game Awards jury. You see.
By proxy,
he very much. By proxy, I'm a little bit moist all of a sudden. Alien Dark Descent. Yes. It's very rare that you get a strategy game that's also a horror game, and therefore give it the nod. Me personally, World of Horror. It's a indie title that's basically Junji Ito meets the Cthulhu mythos in a 1-bit Arkham Horror board game style thing, which sounds really complicated, but it's not. It's hard to play, but it's a charming, very, very fun, very, very brutal roguelike RPG, which I believe is on... It's out of early access now, so that's why I'm nominating it. It's been around for a while, but I think it's on most of the consoles. I don't think it's on all of them yet. And there was one more, but unfortunately I'm having to scroll the list because I can't remember it, and my brain's going all vague. Oh, no. I know what it isn't. It's not Amnesia: The Bunker.
What we're trying to say, folks, is this has been a banger of year for games, and it's been a banger of year for horror games, and this is for the Horror Game Awards and Horror Game of the Year. And I think you know, we keep mentioning, you know, that writer, that fabled writer, and the adventure that he went on.
Oh, yeah, of course, Alan Wake, yeah.
But you know, when it comes to that horror experience, this is what we've nominated today. It's Dead Space, and I think it's delivered something special. If you haven't played it, go and play it. Go and vote for it as well. Steve, did you have any final thoughts on Dead Space before we wrap up?
It's a bit good, isn't it? Like,
I think you need a T-shirt with that, you know, where it's
a bit good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh goodness me! You see, this is one of those things where I could really go into the weeds. I don't want to. In terms of a Phoenix from the Ashes, if this is the last Dead Space game we get, we have got perhaps one of the, you know, not only like a fantastic game, one of the best games of all time. Period. Like, if you want a horror game that also has a story that is digestible but also substantial, you could really do yourself worse than play Dead Space Remake. Also happens to be one of the best remakes of the past decade. Well said.
Well said. Well, thanks for watching our First Aid Spray nomination video. Thank you to the organisers of the event, the organisers of the Horror Game Awards, and good luck to everybody that gets nominated. We've had a blast doing this again, and bring on more horror games. Long live horror games. Until then, nothing else remains from us, and I guess the wise words of somebody else I know, have a good week. I was like, trying to think of a sign off. What shall I do? I was like, I'll just steal size.